clawed hands trembled as she cradled the tiny against her scaled chest. Breathing came in shallow gasps, his usually vibrant golden scales now dull and gray with hunger. The little one hadn't eaten properly in 12 cycles, and her heart broke with each weak chirp he made. The settlement had nothing left to offer. The protein farms had failed when the solar storms hit, and the emergency supplies ran out days ago. The Council of Elders refused to ask for help from other worlds, claiming it would show weakness. Pride, they said, was more important than survival. But was a mother first and a second. She had heard whispers about the human mining colony on the far side of the mountain range. Terrible stories, mostly. Humans were said to be violent, unpredictable creatures who destroyed everything they touched. They had arrived on Zephyr Prime only 2 standard years ago, and most of her people avoided them completely. Yet other whispers spoke differently. Some said humans were surprisingly generous with food. Others claimed they had healing knowledge that seemed almost magical. The stories contradicted each other so much that didn't know what to believe. What she did know was that would die without help. The journey across the wasteland took 6 hours. Feet were bleeding by the time she reached the human settlement, but she pressed on. The mining colony sprawled before her like a metal infection on the planet's surface, all sharp angles and harsh lights. Massive machines moved Earth with frightening efficiency, and the noise was incredible. She had never seen anything like it. Humans everywhere, wearing bright orange clothing and hard hats. They moved with purpose and energy that amazed her. Despite all the stories about their supposed violence, none of them seemed to notice one desperate mother approaching their camp. Found herself standing before a large building with symbols she couldn't read. Through the transparent walls, she could see humans sitting around tables, consuming food and liquid. The smells coming from inside made her stomach clench with hunger and stirred weakly in her arms. A massive human emerged from the building, and courage nearly failed her. He stood almost twice her height, with arms like tree trunks and hands that could probably crush her skull. His skin was weathered brown from sun and work, and his eyes were the strangest color she had ever seen, bright blue like the sky before a storm. This had to be their leader. Humans always put their strongest in charge, according to the stories. The giant human stopped when he saw her, tilting his head curiously. He said something in the human language, but she didn't understand. When she didn't respond, he tried again, slower this time, and she caught a few words. Her people had learned some human speech for trade purposes, though she had never used it herself. "Help," she managed to say in broken human words. "Baby, hungry, please." She held out toward him, hoping the universal language of a mother's desperation would translate across species. The little's eyes were barely open, and his usual bright chirping had faded to almost nothing. The human's expression changed completely. The wariness vanished, replaced by something recognized despite the alien features' concern. He looked from her to and back again, and she saw understanding dawn in those strange blue eyes. "Jake," he said, pointing to himself. Then he gestured toward the building. "Come, food." Hesitated, every story she had heard warned against trusting humans. They were unpredictable, dangerous, not to be trusted, but made a tiny sound of distress, and her decision was made. She followed Jake into the human building. The interior was overwhelming. Bright lights, strange smells, and more humans than she had ever seen in one place. Conversations stopped as they noticed her, and she found herself the center of dozens of stares. Some seemed curious, others suspicious, but none appeared hostile. Jake led her to a quiet corner and gestured for her to sit. The furniture was designed for human proportions, but she managed to settle into a chair while keeping secure in her arms. The little was so still now that she feared he might already be gone. Jake returned quickly with a plate of food and a cup of liquid. The food was unlike anything from her world: chunks of cooked meat, colorful vegetables, and some kind of grain. The smell was incredible, but she didn't know if any of it was safe for biology. "Safe?" she asked, pointing to the food and then to herself. Jake paused, clearly thinking. He pulled out a small device and spoke into it rapidly in human language. Within minutes, another human arrived, smaller than Jake, with long hair and more delicate features. This one carried a bag full of instruments. Dr. Sarah, the newcomer, introduced herself, speaking slower and clearer than Jake had. "I know some biology." Hopes rose, baby sick, hungry many days. Doctor examined the food on the plate, then looked at with professional interest. "May I?" she asked, gesturing toward hesitated, then slowly extended toward the human doctor. Doctor's hands were gentle as she examined him, checking his breathing and the color of his scales. Her touch was careful, respectful, and found herself relaxing slightly. "Dehydration," doctor diagnosed. "Malnutrition, but treatable." She took several items from her bag, a small tube and what looked like a feeding device. "This, safe for young, nutrients, water very good." Watched in amazement as doctor prepared the mixture. The human doctor's movements were precise and confident, and she clearly knew what she was doing. When she offered the feeding tube to, the little barely had strength to respond. But respond he did. After a few drops of the human-made nutrition mixture, his eyes brightened slightly. After a few more, he began to actively drink. Within minutes, he was making soft, chirping sounds again. Tears of relief streamed down his face. She looked up at Jake, who had been watching silently, and saw something in his expression that she never expected to see from a human, genuine happiness at her joy. "Thank you," she whispered in her own language, then tried to repeat it in human words. "Thank you." Jake smiled, and suddenly he didn't look like the terrifying giant she had first seen. He looked like someone who understood what it meant to care for others. Doctor continued feeding, explaining in simple terms what she was doing. The nutrition mixture was something humans used for their own young, but apparently the basic requirements were similar enough that it would help a two. As grew stronger, his scales began to regain their golden color. Other humans had gathered at a respectful distance, watching with interest but not interfering. Could hear them talking quietly among themselves, and while she couldn't understand the words, the tone seemed positive. Several were actually smiling. These were not the violent, dangerous creatures she had been told about. These humans had shown her more kindness in 1 hour than her own people had shown in days. As finally fell into a peaceful, well-fed sleep in her arms, looked around at the humans surrounding her, and realized that everything she thought she knew about them was wrong. Jake sat down across from her, and Doctor took a seat beside him. Both humans looked at her expectantly and realized they were waiting for her to explain what had happened. "Settlement, no food," she began slowly, searching for human words. "Storms, killed plants, council say, no help from others, pride more important than." She struggled to find the right word, then simply pointed at. Jake's face darkened with understanding. "They let children starve for pride." Nodded sadly. "Many little ones sick, mine, only one I could carry." The two humans exchanged a look that needed no translation. Doctor spoke first. "How many children, how many little ones?" 15 families, maybe 30 young ones." Jake stood up abruptly, and for a moment feared she had somehow offended him, but his next words surprised her. "We help all of them." Doctor nodded agreement. "Human way, we protect young ones, all young ones." Stared at them in amazement. They were offering to help her entire settlement's children, despite having known her for less than 2 hours. Despite their species being strangers to each other, despite every barrier of language and culture between them. "Why?" she asked simply. Jake's answer was equally simple: "Because it's right." As if to emphasize his point, several other humans approached with more food and drink for herself. They seemed to have figured out what was safe for biology, because everything they offered was plant-based and smelled wonderful. While she ate her first real meal in days, watched the humans around her and began to understand something important. These beings didn't help because they expected something in return or because it benefited them politically. They helped because they saw suffering and couldn't ignore it. It was the most alien thing about them, and the most wonderful. Stirred in her arms, making happy little sounds as he dreamed. His scales were already brighter, and his breathing was strong and steady. The human medicine had worked better and faster than anything her own people possessed. "Tomorrow," Jake said, interrupting her thoughts, "we bring supplies to settlement, food for all." "Council not allow," warned. "They say humans dangerous, they forbid contact." Jake's smile was not pleasant. "They forbid contact while children starve." "Yes, pride very important to Council." Then Council about to learn human opinion of pride versus children. Doctor chuckled. Jake not subtle but effective. As the evening wore on, more humans came to check on and offer assistance too. Each interaction taught her something new about these remarkable beings. They shared food freely, offered medical help without payment, and seemed genuinely interested in learning about her culture. One young human, barely more than a child himself, brought her a soft blanket for. Another offered her pictures of his own family, pointing proudly to images of small human children. The message was clear. They understood what it meant to love and protect the young. By the time night fell, had made a decision that would change everything. She was not going back to the settlement alone. She was going back with humans who would ensure that no child starved for the sake of political pride. The council was about to discover that humans had very strong opinions about protecting children, regardless of species. And Jake, she suspected, was not the type of human who took no for an answer when children's lives were at stake. Dawn came too early but she woke to the wonderful sound of chirping happily in her arms. The little was almost back to his normal golden color, and his energy had returned enough that he was trying to explore everything within reach of his tiny claws. Jake appeared at her makeshift sleeping area with a cup of the warm human drink they called coffee and a plate of food. His massive frame moved with surprising gentleness as he set them down beside her. "Ready?" he asked simply. Looked out through the transparent walls of the human building. 3 large vehicles sat outside, loaded with supplies. At least a dozen humans were checking equipment and loading additional crates. Doctor stood near one vehicle, organizing medical supplies with efficient precision. "Council will be very angry," warned. Jake's expression didn't change. "Good, angry means they're paying attention." Within an hour, the convoy was ready to move. Rode in the lead vehicle with Jake, Doctor, and the little seemed fascinated by everything he saw through the windows, making excited chirping sounds at the strange human machines and the landscape rushing past. The journey to the settlement took half the time it had taken on foot. The human vehicles moved with incredible speed and efficiency across terrain that would have been nearly impossible to cross any other way. As they approached the settlement, could see gathering at the perimeter, their postures defensive and uncertain. Word of the approaching humans had clearly spread quickly. Elder Thane emerged from the council chamber, his ceremonial robes billowing dramatically. His expression was thunderous as he saw in the lead vehicle, and his anger only intensified when he spotted the human convoy behind her. Jake stopped the vehicles just outside the settlement boundary and stepped out slowly, his hands visible and empty. The other humans followed his lead, moving with careful deliberation to avoid appearing threatening. Elder Thane's voice carried clearly across the distance. "Of the Southern Grove, you have violated the sacred prohibition against contact with the dangerous outsiders." "I have saved my son's life," replied, climbing down from the vehicle within her arms. The little chirped cheerfully, his bright golden scales gleaming in the morning sun. The gathered murmured in surprise. Everyone could see how healthy and vibrant looked, a dramatic change from the dying child they had last seen. Elder Thane's composure cracked slightly. How is this possible?" Doctor stepped forward, her medical bag clearly visible. "Human medicine, human food, human care." "Humans help sick children," Jake added in his careful. The words were pronounced awkwardly, but their meaning was unmistakable. "We do not need help from outsiders," Elder Thane declared, but his voice lacked conviction as he looked at the obviously thriving. "Tell that to them," said, pointing toward a group of mothers who had emerged from their homes. Several carried listless, obviously malnourished young ones in their arms. The contrast between health and the condition of the other children was stark and heartbreaking. Jake saw the suffering children and something in his expression hardened. He turned to his team and spoke rapidly in human language. Within minutes, they were unloading crates of supplies and setting up what was clearly a medical station. "Stop," Elder Thane commanded. "I forbid this intrusion." Jake looked up from the supplies he was organizing, his blue eyes cold as winter sky. When he spoke, his voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "Children are dying, we have food and medicine. You can help us distribute it or you can get out of our way. Those are your only choices." The simple directness of his statement seemed to catch Elder Thane off guard. In culture, important discussions involved elaborate speeches and complex negotiations. Jake's approach was utterly foreign. Doctor had already approached the nearest mother with a sick child, moving slowly and speaking in gentle tones. The woman looked terrified, but when she saw how healthy and happy was in SARMs, she allowed the human doctor to examine her own little one. Other human team members were setting up feeding stations and unpacking medical supplies. Their efficiency was remarkable. Within 20 minutes, they had established a complete aid operation. "This is unprecedented," Elder Thane protested. "The Council has not approved these actions." "The Council," Jake said without looking up from his work, "can approve saving children, or they can explain to their people why they chose to let children die instead. Up to you." More mothers were approaching now, drawn by the sight of human medical equipment and the obvious improvement in its condition. Fear warred with desperation on their faces, but desperation was winning. Doctor was working on her third patient, a tiny even younger than. The human nutrition formula seemed to work just as well on this child, and within minutes the little one was showing signs of improvement. "It's working," one of the mothers whispered in amazement. "The human medicine actually works." Elder Thane tried one more time to assert control. "These outsiders seek to make us dependent on them. They will demand payment we cannot afford." Jake finally looked up from his work, and his expression was genuinely confused. "Payment for helping sick children." The concept seemed so foreign to him that he had trouble understanding it. Doctor laughed softly. "Jake, they don't know us yet. They think we're like their politicians." This seemed to amuse Jake greatly. "Lady," he said to Elder Thane, "we're miners, not merchants. We see a problem, we fix it. That's what we do." By midday, every sick child in the settlement had been examined and treated. The transformation was remarkable. Young ones who had been listless and gray with hunger were now playing together, their scales bright and their energy restored. The human team had also distributed enough food supplies to last several weeks, along with detailed instructions on how to prepare nutrition supplements using local ingredients and human techniques. Elder Thane stood watching the scene with obvious internal conflict. His pride demanded that he reject this help, but the evidence of its success was impossible to ignore. "Why?" he finally asked Jake. "What do you gain from this?" Jake paused in his cleanup efforts and looked around at the playing children, then back at the elder. "My daughter would be about their age if she had lived," he said quietly. "Back on Earth, cancer took her when she was 5. The raw pain in his voice was unmistakable, even across species lines. Elder Thane's hostility visibly diminished. "Every time I see a child suffer when I can help," Jake continued, "I think about Sarah, about how I would have given anything for someone to save her." Doctor placed a gentle hand on Jake's shoulder. "We all have our reasons, but the result is the same: children live instead of dying. That's enough reason for any human." Approached Elder Thane within her arms. The little was now actively trying to escape her grip to go play with the other children. "Look at him," she said simply. "Yesterday he was dying, today he wants to play. The humans did this in one day with no payment, no contracts, no promises of future benefit. They did it because it was right." Elder Thane looked down at the energetic little, then around at all the other children who had been transformed by human intervention. "Perhaps," he said slowly, "we have been too quick to judge these newcomers." Jake stood up, wiping his hands on a cloth. "Judging is fine. Just don't let judgment stop you from accepting help when your people need it." As the human team prepared to leave, promising to return in a few days with more supplies, something extraordinary happened. The children approached the human vehicles, offering small gifts, pretty stones, handmade toys, flowers from the settlement gardens. The humans accepted these gifts with obvious pleasure, treating each offering as something precious. Several of the human team members knelt down to the children's level to thank them personally. Squirmed out of SARMs and toddled over to Jake, offering him a small wooden carving he had been playing with. Jake accepted it with the same gravity he might have shown receiving a diplomatic treaty. "Thank you, little warrior," Jake said softly, ruffling the scales on his head. Elder Thane witnessed this exchange, and something in his expression changed permanently. That evening, as the human convoy disappeared over the horizon, Elder Thane called an emergency session of the council. "We have misjudged these humans," he announced to the assembled elders. "They possess a strength we did not recognize, the strength to help without expecting return. This is not weakness. This is power we do not understand." Who had been invited to speak to the council for the first time in her life, stood within her arms. "They saved my son when we would not," she said simply. "They saved all our children when pride said we should refuse help. Maybe it's time we learned what humans call strength." The council voted unanimously to establish formal contact with the human settlement. It was the beginning of something neither species had expected, a friendship based not on mutual benefit or political advantage, but on the simple recognition that some things were more important than pride. And in her arms, chirped happily, unaware that he had become the catalyst for changing the relationship between two worlds. But the greatest changes were still to come. 3 weeks after the humans first arrived at the settlement, had become something of a celebrity. The little who had nearly died from starvation was now the healthiest, most energetic child in the entire community. But more than that, he had developed some very unusual abilities. First noticed it when began imitating human sounds. Children typically didn't start speaking until their second year, but was already making recognizable attempts at human words. Doctor, who had become a regular visitor to check on all the children, was fascinated. "He's learning both languages simultaneously," she explained to and Jake during one of their weekly meetings. "Most young minds can handle multiple languages, but seems to understand the concepts behind them as well as the sounds." Jake watched as played with a small human toy, a mechanical device that moved when wound up. The little had figured out how to operate it after watching Jake demonstrate it just once. Now he was taking it apart and putting it back together with remarkable precision for someone barely old enough to walk properly. "He's not just learning languages," Jake observed. "Look at what he's doing with that toy." Doctor followed his gaze and her eyebrows rose. Had not only reassembled the toy perfectly, he had somehow modified it to move in a completely different pattern. The changes he had made were subtle but effective, improving the toy's balance and extending its operational time. "That should be impossible," Doctor murmured. "He doesn't have the fine motor control for that kind of precision work." But he did. Somehow, exposure to human technology and methods had unlocked capabilities in that no one expected. His claws, which should have been too large and clumsy for delicate work, moved with surgical precision. His understanding of mechanical principles seemed almost intuitive. Elder Thane, who had become increasingly interested in human capabilities, witnessed this demonstration with obvious amazement. "Our children develop slowly," he admitted to Jake. "Physical maturity comes first, then intellectual growth, but develops differently now." "Human children learn through play and experimentation," Jake explained. "We encourage them to take things apart, to ask questions, to try new approaches. Maybe that's what is responding to." Doctor had been running detailed scans on all the children they had treated, with permission. The results were remarkable across the board, but development was off the charts. "His brain activity has increased by 40% since we started human nutrition protocols," she reported. "But more than that, the patterns are changing. He's developing neural pathways that we don't see in typical development." "Is this safe?" asked, concerned. As wonderful as growth was, the speed of change worried her. "All indicators suggest he's perfectly healthy," Doctor assured her. "If anything, he's healthier than normal. The human nutrition seems to provide elements that biology can use but doesn't normally have access to." Jake had his own theory. Maybe it's not just the nutrition, maybe it's the stimulation. Human children are constantly challenged to learn and grow. We don't accept that's how it's always been done as a reason to stop trying new things. As if to prove his point, abandoned the toy and waddled over to Jake's work tablet, which had been left on a nearby table. The device was displaying technical schematics for mining equipment, complex diagrams that should have been meaningless to a child. But studied them with obvious interest, occasionally pointing to specific components and making questioning sounds. "He wants to understand what he's looking at," Jake realized. "Watch his eyes, he's following the connection lines, trying to figure out how the system works." Jake sat down beside and began explaining the schematics in simple terms, pointing to each component and describing its function. The little listened intently, occasionally reaching out to trace the lines on the screen with one careful claw. "Pump," said suddenly, pointing to a specific component. His pronunciation was imperfect, but the word was unmistakably correct. Everyone stared. Not only had identified a complex piece of equipment correctly, he had used the proper human technical term for it. Did he just, Doctor started. Yes, Jake said, grinning widely. He understood the explanation and identified the component correctly. Elder Thane looked as if he had witnessed a miracle. Our scholars study for years to understand such concepts. How does a child barely able to walk comprehend technical systems? Because, Jake said, picking up and settling him on his lap in front of the tablet, human children start learning about how things work as soon as they can see and touch. We don't wait until they're old enough to handle complex ideas. We start simple and build up. Over the following days, Jake began bringing small mechanical toys and simple tools. Each time, the little would examine them thoroughly, take them apart if possible, and usually manage to improve them in some small way. The other children, inspired by his example, began showing similar behaviors. Not to the same dramatic extent, but they all demonstrated increased curiosity and learning ability compared to traditional development patterns. Doctor documented everything carefully. We're witnessing the emergence of enhanced cognitive development across an entire generation, she told Jake. This could change society fundamentally. But the most dramatic change came when solved a problem that had been puzzling the human mining operation for weeks. Jake had brought his work home, as he often did, reviewing geological surveys and equipment performance data. The mining operation was highly efficient, but they had been experiencing intermittent problems with their primary extraction system. The equipment would work perfectly for days, then suddenly lose efficiency for no apparent reason. Now a regular fixture in Jake's workspace, watched as Jake puzzled over the problem. The little studied the data displays with his usual intense interest, occasionally pointing to specific readings and making questioning sounds. The pressure readings are inconsistent, Jake explained to him, as he had gotten into the habit of doing. The system should maintain steady output, but something is causing fluctuations. Listened carefully, then waddled over to a physical model of the mining equipment that Jake used for training purposes. The model was accurate, but showing the major components and their relationships. To everyone's amazement, began manipulating the model, pointing to specific components and making urgent chirping sounds. "What is it, little guy?" Jake asked, watching carefully. Continued working with the model, and gradually his intent became clear. He was demonstrating that one of the connecting joints was prone to thermal expansion, which would explain the intermittent efficiency problems. The solution was elegant, a simple modification to allow for expansion without losing system pressure. It was exactly the kind of insight that human engineers might take weeks to develop, but had identified it by observing patterns in the data and understanding the physical relationships between components. "He's right," Jake breathed. "The thermal expansion coefficient for that joint material would cause exactly these pressure fluctuations." Doctor ran detailed scans on after this incident, trying to understand how his cognitive abilities had developed so rapidly. "His brain is processing information in patterns we don't typically see until much later development," she reported. "He's integrating visual, spatial, and logical reasoning in ways that suggest his neural architecture is adapting to human learning methods." "Is he becoming more human?" asked, worried about losing her son's essential nature. "No," Doctor assured her. "He's becoming more than either species alone. He's developing capabilities that combine the best of both and human cognitive approaches." Elder Thane was present for this discussion, and his response surprised everyone. "Perhaps this is what we need," he said thoughtfully. "Our people have grown too comfortable with traditional ways. We avoid change, avoid challenge, avoid risk. But look what accomplishes when he embraces human approaches to learning." Jake nodded. "Humans believe that every child has unlimited potential. We just have to provide the right environment for that potential to develop." "Then we must learn these human methods," Elder Thane decided. "Not just but for all our young ones." As word of remarkable abilities spread through both communities, something unprecedented began to happen. Parents started requesting that their children be included in human learning activities. Human team members began teaching young ones alongside human methods of problem-solving and technical understanding. The collaboration went both ways. Children possessed natural abilities that amazed the humans, enhanced spatial reasoning, instinctive understanding of natural systems, and remarkable pattern recognition skills. "They're teaching each other," Doctor observed during one of the joint learning sessions. The human children are learning approaches to understanding natural systems, while the children are adopting human technical problem-solving methods. Jake watched working with a group that included both human and children, solving engineering problems that would challenge adult specialists. The little had become a bridge between the species, demonstrating that the barriers they thought existed were largely artificial. He's not just learning faster, Jake realized. He's learning differently. He's developing approaches that neither species has used before. The implications were staggering, represented the possibility of cognitive development that transcended the limitations of either species alone. He was becoming something new, not human, but a synthesis that was potentially superior to both. And he was just the beginning. Other children in the joint program were showing similar development patterns. Within months, there might be an entire generation of young ones capable of solving problems and understanding concepts that their parents couldn't even imagine. The desperate mother who had carried her starving to the human Foreman had unknowingly started a revolution in consciousness that would reshape both species forever. And the most incredible part was yet to come. The attack came without warning on a peaceful morning when both communities had finally learned to trust each other. Was watching play with human and children in the newly constructed learning center when the first explosions shook the ground. Jake's emergency communicator crackled to life with urgent reports from the mining operations perimeter sensors. Unknown ships were descending from orbit, and their intentions were clearly hostile. Raider fleet, Jake announced grimly as he studied the incoming data. Looks like hegemony markings. They must have detected our settlement activities. Elder Thane's face went pale. The hegemony was a notorious coalition of aggressive species that viewed peaceful planets as easy targets for resource extraction and slave labor. They had been expanding their territory for decades, crushing any resistance they encountered. We cannot fight them, Elder Thane said helplessly. We have no weapons, no defenses. Our people have never been warriors. Jake's expression hardened with determination. Maybe your people haven't been warriors, but humans have plenty of experience with bullies who think they can take whatever they want. Doctor was already organizing the evacuation of the most vulnerable, the youngest children and their mothers. But even as she worked, everyone could see that there wasn't enough time. The hegemony ships would reach them in minutes, not hours. Tugged on arm, making urgent chirping sounds and pointing toward the human technical equipment. At 18 months old, he was walking confidently, and his vocabulary included words from both languages, but his communication was still limited. "What is it, little one?" asked, following his gaze. Led her to Jake's workstation, where multiple screens displayed real-time data about the approaching threat. The little studied the displays intently, then began manipulating the interface with surprising skill. Jake called urgently, "Is doing something with your equipment." Jake rushed over to find working with the mining operations control systems. The little had somehow accessed the geological survey data and was correlating it with the positions of the approaching hegemony ships. He's analyzing their approach vector, Jake realized with amazement, and he's found something. His tiny claws moved across the interface with precision, highlighting specific geological formations and calculating trajectories. The pattern he was revealing showed that the hegemony ships were approaching through an area of significant geological instability. The mining operations have been testing seismic charges in that sector, Doctor observed, understanding dawning in her voice. If someone could trigger a controlled collapse at exactly the right moment. Jake was already moving toward the mining control systems. It would take perfect timing and precise calculations. One mistake and we accomplish nothing except warning them we're fighting back. Made an urgent sound and pointed to himself, then to the controls. He wants to help, translated, though the meaning was clear enough. He's 18 months old, Elder Thane protested, but his voice lacked conviction. They all had seen what could accomplish when he focused his unusual abilities. Jake looked down at the little, then at the approaching threat on his screens. The first hegemony ships would be within weapons range in 3 minutes. "Can you do it, little warrior?" Jake asked seriously, as if speaking to an adult colleague. Chirped confidently and reached for the controls. What followed was the most remarkable display of cognitive ability anyone had ever witnessed. His mind worked with computer-like precision, calculating mass, velocity, trajectory, and timing variables that would challenge advanced artificial intelligence systems. The little's claws danced across multiple control interfaces simultaneously, programming the mining charges with exact detonation sequences. His understanding of the geological structures was instinctive and perfect. He could see how the formations would collapse, which supports to remove first, how to create a cascading failure that would look like natural seismic activity. 30 seconds, Jake announced, watching the hegemony approach. Made final adjustments to the timing sequences, his golden scales bright with concentration. Every human and in the control center held their breath. 10 seconds, 5, 3, 2, execute. Triggered the sequence. For a moment, nothing seemed to happen. Then the ground beneath the approaching hegemony fleet began to collapse in a carefully orchestrated cascade. What appeared to be a massive natural landslide caught 3 of the 5 enemy ships completely by surprise. The ships tried to gain altitude, but had calculated their escape vectors as well. Secondary charges triggered at precisely the right moments, bringing down additional geological formations that blocked every possible retreat route. 2 ships managed to escape the trap, but they were now separated and confused, their formation broken and their confidence shattered. "Impossible," Elder Thane whispered, staring at the tactical display. "No one could calculate such precise timing. The variables are too complex." But had done exactly that. More than that, he was already working on the next phase of the defense. The Little had accessed the mining operations' heavy equipment controls and was coordinating the movement of massive excavation machines. To outside observers, it would look like the mining operation was simply continuing normal activities, but was positioning each piece of equipment to create overlapping fields of fire. "He's turned our industrial equipment into weapons," Jake realized with admiration. "Those excavators can throw massive rocks with incredible accuracy." The remaining hegemony ships approached more cautiously now, clearly uncertain about what had caused the geological disaster that had destroyed their companions. Their scans would show normal mining operations and no obvious military defenses. They never suspected that their most dangerous opponent was an 18-month-old, with an unprecedented understanding of physics and engineering. Waited until the enemy ships moved into optimal position, then triggered his improvised defense system. Massive excavation machines began launching precisely aimed geological projectiles with the accuracy of guided missiles. The hegemony ships found themselves under attack from weapons they couldn't understand or defend against. Huge chunks of rock struck with devastating effect, guided by targeting calculations that accounted for planetary rotation, atmospheric resistance, and enemy ship movement patterns. Within minutes, the remaining hegemony ships were either destroyed or retreating at maximum speed. The control center erupted in cheers, but seemed unaware of the celebration around him. He was still focused on the displays, making sure the threat was completely eliminated before relaxing his vigilance. Only when the last enemy ship disappeared beyond sensor range did the Little finally step back from the controls. He looked up at Jake with an expression that seemed to ask if he had done well. Jake knelt down and gathered into a gentle embrace. "You saved everyone, little warrior. You saved both our peoples." Doctor was already analyzing what had happened, her scientific mind struggling to comprehend the implications. "He processed more complex calculations in 10 minutes than our best computers could handle in hours," she reported in amazement. "His cognitive architecture has evolved beyond anything we thought possible." Elder Thane approached with obvious reverence. "You have gifts that surpass anything in our history. You are truly something new." But it was who understood the most important truth. Her son had not just saved their communities. He had demonstrated what was possible when the best qualities of both species were combined and enhanced. "He learned from humans to question and experiment," she said proudly. "He learned from to understand natural systems, but what he accomplished today came from his own mind, his own unique way of seeing problems and solutions." Jake nodded thoughtfully. "The other children in the joint program are developing similar capabilities, maybe not to the same extent as, but they're all showing enhanced cognitive development." "Then perhaps," Elder Thane said slowly, The future belongs to this new generation, children who think beyond the limitations that have divided our species. As if summoned by his words, other children from both communities began arriving at the control center. They had somehow sensed that something important had happened and wanted to understand. Immediately began showing them what he had done, explaining in his mixture of human and words how he had analyzed the geological data and calculated the defense sequences. The other children listened with fascination, and several began asking to try similar calculations themselves. Doctor watched this impromptu lesson with growing excitement. They're teaching each other. Knowledge and capabilities that took weeks to develop are being transferred to others in minutes. Collective learning, Jake realized. They're not just individual geniuses, they're creating a network of enhanced intelligence. As the day ended, and both communities began to process what had happened, one thing became clear. The desperate mother who had carried her starving to the human Foreman had set in motion changes that would reshape their entire region of space. The hegemony would be back, probably with larger forces and better preparation. But when they returned, they would face not just human determination or wisdom, but something entirely new, a generation of young minds that could outthink any challenge the galaxy could present. And the little who had been dying of hunger just months before had become the first of a new kind of consciousness that would change everything. 6 months after the hegemony attack, representatives from 12 different species had requested permission to visit the joint human settlement. Word of remarkable abilities and the enhanced cognitive development of the other children had spread throughout this sector of the galaxy. Watched her son demonstrate problem-solving techniques to a delegation of crystalline mathematicians, beings whose species was renowned throughout known space for their analytical capabilities. At 2 years old, was not only keeping up with their complex equations, but suggesting improvements to their traditional methods. Impossible, the lead crystalline delegate stated through his translation device. No organic mind should be capable of such computational precision. Jake smiled as he watched work. The little had grown significantly. His golden scales now shot through with strange new patterns that seemed to shimmer when he was concentrating deeply. His vocabulary included elements from 6 different languages, and he could communicate complex technical concepts with remarkable clarity. Jake said gently, "Show them the gravity wave prediction model you developed last week." Chirped happily and began manipulating a holographic display that showed a 3-dimensional representation of local space-time. His tiny claws moved with impossible precision, adjusting variables and demonstrating how gravitational anomalies could be predicted days in advance. The crystalline delegate's geometric forms actually shifted color with amazement, equivalent to gasping in shock for their species. This child has developed mathematical intuitions that our greatest scholars require decades to achieve, the lead delegate admitted. How is this possible? Doctor, who had become something of a celebrity in research circles, stepped forward with her latest findings. Represents the emergence of a new form of consciousness, she explained. Human adaptability and innovation combined with pattern recognition and natural intuition, but enhanced beyond what either species could achieve alone. More than that, added Elder Thane, who now served as the primary liaison for relations. The other children are developing similar capabilities. We have 47 young ones showing enhanced cognitive development, and the rate of advancement is accelerating. The truth was even more remarkable than they were sharing publicly. The enhanced children weren't just individually brilliant. They had developed a form of collective problem-solving that was revolutionizing every field they touched. When faced with complex challenges, the children would spontaneously organize into working groups, with each child contributing their unique cognitive strengths. Excelled at mathematical modeling and systems analysis, but others specialized in biological sciences, energy manipulation, materials engineering, or social dynamics. Together, they could solve problems that had puzzled adult experts for generations. The visiting delegates were shown to the new research facilities that had been constructed to support the children's education. What they found there challenged every assumption about learning and development. 3-year-old, a female, was working on what appeared to be a new form of sustainable energy generation. Her approach combined human engineering principles with understanding of natural energy flows, creating designs that were both technically sophisticated and environmentally harmonious. 5-year-old Tommy, one of the human children who had been part of the program from the beginning, had developed new medical techniques that combined doctors' knowledge with insights gained from studying healing methods. His innovations had already saved dozens of lives throughout the sector. But perhaps most remarkable was the collaboration between all the enhanced children on what they called the project. Jake found working on it one morning, surrounded by displays showing everything from stellar cartography to biological systems analysis. The little looked up when he saw Jake approaching. "Making better," announced in his clear, precise voice. He had long since graduated beyond simple chirping, though he still made the happy sounds when excited. "Making what better, little warrior?" Gestured to the displays which showed a comprehensive analysis of their entire stellar region. "Everything. Better ways for all peoples to live together, better ways to share resources, better ways to prevent wars." Jake studied the displays more carefully and felt his breath catch. What and the other children were developing wasn't just a theoretical exercise. It was a practical framework for cooperation that addressed every major source of conflict in their region of space. The mathematical models predicted resource flows with incredible accuracy. The social dynamics algorithms accounted for the psychological needs of dozens of different species. The technological solutions were elegant, sustainable, and adaptable to virtually any environment. "How long have you been working on this?" Jake asked. "Since the bad ships came," replied matter-of-factly. "Wanted to make sure no more bad ships, so we make everything better instead." Doctor appeared at Jake's shoulder, having been monitoring work through the facility's observation systems. "They're not just solving current problems," she said softly. "They're redesigning civilization from the ground up, based on cooperation and mutual benefit instead of competition and conflict." The implications were staggering. If the children's plans were implemented, the entire power structure of their galactic region would be transformed. Instead of the current system of competing empires and resource wars, there would be a network of interdependent communities, each contributing their unique strengths to the benefit of all. The hegemony and similar aggressive coalitions would become irrelevant in a galaxy where cooperation was more profitable than conquest. "Will it work?" Jake asked. Looked up at him with eyes that seemed far too wise for such a young face. "Already working. Other children on other worlds are learning our methods. Ideas spread faster than ships." It was true. The enhanced children had developed communication techniques that allowed them to share knowledge across interstellar distances. What one child learned, others could access within days. The network of enhanced consciousness was growing exponentially. As word of the project spread, more species began requesting inclusion in the joint development program. Not for military advantage or economic benefit, but because they recognized that their children could be part of something unprecedented in galactic history. The desperate mother who had carried her starving to a human Foreman had unknowingly triggered the emergence of a new form of galactic civilization. Often reflected on this as she watched work with children from a dozen different species, all of them enhanced by the combination of human innovation, wisdom, and their own unique cognitive gifts. "Did you know?" she asked Jake one evening as they watched the children collaborate on another breakthrough in interstellar communication technology. "When you first helped us, did you know it would lead to all this?" Jake shook his head. "I just saw a mother with a sick child. Everything else." He gestured at the thriving research complex, the playing children, the peaceful cooperation between species that had been strangers just 2 years before. Everything else grew from that one simple decision to help. Elder Thane joined them, carrying reports from the Council of Worlds. 3 more species have requested to join the Cooperative Alliance," he announced. "The hegemony is finding it increasingly difficult to recruit new members, and several of their existing partners are asking about conversion to cooperative status." "Predicted this would happen," Jake said with pride. He said that once people saw how much more they could accomplish through cooperation, competition for resources would seem primitive and wasteful. As if summoned by his name, appeared at their side. At barely over 2 years old, he moved with confidence and purpose that would be remarkable in an adult. "New discovery," he announced happily. Found way to help other children on distant worlds become enhanced like us without needing human nutrition or training. Can use any species' strengths as starting point. The implications hit all three adults simultaneously. If was right, then enhanced cognitive development could spread to any species, anywhere in the galaxy. Within a generation, there could be enhanced children throughout known space, all working together on solutions to the problems that had plagued galactic civilization for. The incredible occurred, murmured, remembering her desperate journey across the wasteland with her dying son in her arms. What's that? Jake asked. You helped a starving child, replied, watching run back to his friends with excitement about his latest discovery. And that simple act of kindness changed everything. Jake followed her gaze to where dozens of enhanced children from multiple species were working together, solving problems and building bridges between worlds that had been strangers or enemies for centuries. Maybe that's the most human thing of all, he said thoughtfully. The belief that helping one person, even when it seems impossible or pointless, can change the entire universe. Above them, the first ships of the new Cooperative Alliance fleet moved peacefully through space, carrying supplies, knowledge, and friendship to worlds throughout the sector. The hegemony still existed, but their influence diminished daily as more species chose cooperation over conquest. And in research facilities across a dozen worlds, enhanced children worked on solutions to challenges that had once seemed insurmountable. All because a desperate mother had carried her hungry to a human foreman, and the human had chosen compassion over caution. The incredible had indeed occurred, and it was still spreading throughout the galaxy, one enhanced child at a time. The future belonged to those who believed that helping others was not weakness, but the greatest strength any species could possess. And at the center of it all, a little golden named continued to grow, to learn, and to build bridges between worlds that would have been unthinkable just a few years before. The transformation was complete, but the real journey was just beginning.